Hello, welcome to Sleepless Veteran. If you're here to rest, to let your mind settle while learning something quietly, you've come to the right place. We tell military history slowly, without urgency, without drama. Just facts unfolding at a pace that lets you breathe, that lets you process, that lets you drift if you need to. Tonight, we're going to a specific moment, a specific place, a specific time. July 30th, 1915. Hooge Crater, Belgium, the Western Front. A war that had already introduced horrors. Artillery that killed thousands. Machine guns that mowed down waves of men. Poison gas that choked and blinded. The Western Front by July 1915 had shown what modern industrial warfare meant, had demonstrated what technology could do to human bodies, had revealed depths of suffering that previous generations couldn't have imagined. But on this night, something new was introduced, something that hadn't been used in warfare before. Not in this form, not mechanized, not tactical, not deliberate. Fire. Fire as weapon. Fire projected from a device. Fire that arced through darkness. Fire that fell into trenches. Fire that burned men. Fire that created terror, unlike anything the defenders had experienced. The flamethrower. The Flammenwerfer in German. The weapon that made fire tactical. That made burning a method. That crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. This is a story about a moment. About 3:15 a.m. on July 30th. About flames appearing in darkness. About defenders who had never seen anything like this, who had no concept that this was possible, who panicked instantly, who fled positions they had sworn to hold, who were defeated more by terror than by fire. This is a story about innovation in warfare, about how new weapons are introduced, about how thresholds are crossed, about how what is unthinkable becomes standard, about how horror normalizes, about how the first use of a weapon becomes precedent for thousands of uses. This is also a story about fire, about humanity's oldest fear, about the primal terror that fire creates, about why burning is different from other ways of dying, about why fire weapon was uniquely effective, not because it killed more efficiently, because it terrified more completely, because it exploited fear that was instinctive, that was evolutionary, that was impossible to overcome through training or courage or determination. The fire that humans have feared since the beginning, the fire that was made into weapon, the fire that was unleashed at Hooge. So settle in, get comfortable. What follows is the story of one night, of one attack, of one weapon, of one threshold crossed. We'll begin with the moment itself, with 3:15 a.m., with flames appearing, with terror spreading. Then we'll step back. We'll understand how we got to that moment, what the weapon was, how it was developed, why it was used. Then we'll follow the aftermath, the consequences, the legacy, the line from Hooge to decades of fire weapons, to a threshold that remains crossed, to horror that was introduced and couldn't be uninvented. The story begins in darkness, in trenches at Hooge, in the minutes before 3:15 a.m., in the moment before knowledge, before British troops learned that fire was now weapon, before they experienced terror they couldn't have imagined, before the threshold was crossed, before modern warfare first turned into fire. Let's begin. At Hooge, at 3:15 a.m., July 30th, 1915, when the flames appeared, the artillery had been thundering for 20 minutes. The British troops in the trenches around Hooge Crater waited in their dugouts. The bombardment was heavy, heavier than usual. The shells fell continuously, struck the trenches, struck the communication lines, struck the rear areas. The troops knew this pattern. Artillery bombardment followed by infantry attack. The pattern was standard, was expected, was how attacks happened. The troops waited for the bombardment to end, waited to return to fire positions, waited to defend against the infantry assault that would follow. The waiting was tense, was focused, was preparing mentally for combat, for the fight that was coming. The troops checked weapons, checked ammunition, checked grenades, prepared to defend. The bombardment continued. The waiting continued. The preparation continued. The bombardment stopped. The sudden silence was jarring. The troops emerged from dugouts, moved to firing positions, peered into darkness, looked for the infantry. The attack would come now, would come in seconds, would come in waves. The troops were ready, were alert, were watching. The darkness was total. The smoke from artillery obscured vision. The visibility was minimal. The troops strained to see, to detect movement, to identify targets. The seconds passed. The tension mounted. Where was the attack? Where was the infantry? Where were the Germans? The troops waited, watched, prepared to fire. The moment stretched. The darkness revealed nothing. The smoke revealed nothing. The troops waited, ready, alert, tense. Then they saw it. The flame, appearing from darkness. A stream of fire, orange, bright, shocking, arcing through the air, coming toward them, coming from German lines, coming fast. The troops stared, couldn't process, couldn't understand. What was this? What was happening? What was this fire? The stream arced, fell, landed in the trench, 50 meters away, 40 meters. The fire spread, clung to everything, burned. The light was intense, was orange, was flickering, illuminated the trench, illuminated the men, illuminated the horror. Another stream appeared, another arc of fire, falling into another section, then another, then more. The flames appearing from multiple points, falling into trenches, into positions, into the men. The sound was distinctive, was roaring, was rushing, was whooshing, the sound of propelled liquid, the sound of ignition, the sound of burning. The sound was loud, was clear despite the distance, was unlike any weapon sound, was unlike artillery or machine guns or rifles, was new sound, was fire sound. The troops heard it, heard the roar, heard the rush, heard the burning, the sound that accompanied the light. That came with the flames. That announced what was happening, the sound that would become familiar, that would become feared, that would become signature of fire weapon. But in this moment was unknown, was shocking, was incomprehensible. The men who were struck by fire began, screaming. The screaming was immediate, was piercing, was agony. The fire clung to them, burned their uniforms, burned their skin, burned everything. The men tried to beat out the flames, tried to remove burning clothes, tried to escape the fire. The fire wouldn't extinguish, was designed not to extinguish, was sticky, was persistent, was fuel that burned until consumed. The men screamed, writhed, fell. The screaming continued, was heard by other troops, was heard along the line, was heard by men who couldn't see what was happening, who just heard the screaming, who heard the agony, who heard evidence of horror they couldn't see. The panic was instant. The troops who saw the flames coming didn't wait, didn't think, didn't decide, just reacted, just fled. The reaction was instinctive, was primal, was evolutionary response to fire. The humans who fled from fire survived. The humans who didn't died. The instinct was hardwired, was beyond conscious control, was impossible to override through training or discipline or courage. The fire appeared. The troops fled. The reaction was automatic. The panic spread. The men who hadn't seen flames heard the screaming, heard the commotion, heard others fleeing, fled themselves. The contagion was total, was instant, was uncontrollable. Within seconds the trenches were emptying, the troops were running, were abandoning positions, were fleeing to rear. The defense was collapsing, not through being destroyed, through being terrified, through being panicked, through facing something that couldn't be faced. That instinct wouldn't allow facing. The officers tried to stop the flight, tried to rally the men, shouted orders, blocked paths, grabbed fleeing soldiers. Nothing worked. The troops wouldn't stop, wouldn't stay, wouldn't listen, just pushed past, just continued fleeing, just sought safety, sought distance from the fire, from the flames, from the horror. The officers were swept along, were unable to control, were unable to restore order, were unable to stop the panic. The flight continued. The trenches emptied. The positions were abandoned. The crater was abandoned. The entire defensive line in this sector was abandoned within minutes. Within the time it took for the flames to appear, for the panic to spread, for the flight to empty the trenches. The Germans had achieved complete success, had captured objectives without fighting, had taken positions without resistance, had won through terror, through fire, through weaponizing the oldest human fear. The German infantry followed, advanced carefully, moved into the trenches, found them empty, found positions abandoned, found weapons dropped, found equipment scattered, found evidence of flight, of panic, of rout. The German soldiers were shocked themselves, were surprised by effectiveness, were unprepared for complete collapse, were cautious, expected trap, expected counterattack, found nothing, found empty trenches, found victory without fighting, found objectives achieved without cost. The success was total, was beyond expectations, was proof that the weapon worked, that fire was effective, that terror was tactic, that the flamethrower was successful beyond what had been hoped. The attack that had begun at 3:15 a.m. was over by 3:30. 15 minutes. 15 minutes to achieve what months of conventional attacks had failed to achieve. 15 minutes to capture Hooge Crater. 15 minutes to prove that fire was now weapon, that burning was now tactic, that terror was now method. The flames had appeared at 3:15 a.m. By 3:30, the battle was won. The positions were captured. The threshold was crossed. Fire had become weapon. Modern warfare had turned into fire. The moment was complete. The first flamethrower attack was successful. The weapon was proven. The precedent was established. The threshold was crossed. At 3:15 a.m., at Hooge, July 30th, 1915, when the flames appeared, when fire became weapon, when everything changed. Hooge was village near Ypres in Belgium, was on the Menin road running east from the city. The location had strategic importance, was high ground, overlooked the Ypres salient, controlled approaches. The village before the war was small, was typical Belgian settlement, had church, had houses, had farms, was peaceful, was ordinary. The war destroyed it. The fighting in 1914 reduced the village to rubble. The buildings were shelled, were burned, were collapsed. By 1915, nothing remained of the village. Just ruins, just scattered stones, just the name. Hooge existed on maps, existed in military planning, existed as a designation for location. But the village was gone, was obliterated, was erased by warfare. The crater was created by British action. On June 19, 1915, British forces detonated a mine under German positions at Hooge. The mine was massive, contained several thousand pounds of explosives, was planted by tunneling beneath German lines. The detonation was at 7 p.m. The explosion was enormous. Created crater approximately 120 feet across, approximately 40 feet deep. The German positions above the mine were destroyed. The soldiers in those positions were killed, buried, vaporized. The explosion succeeded tactically, destroyed German strong point, created crater that British forces immediately occupied. The crater became British position, was fortified, was defended, became part of British line. The crater by July was established position, was connected to British trenches by communication trenches, had dugouts built into the sides, had firing positions, had sandbag walls, had barbed wire, was fortified strong point, was defended by infantry, was considered secure. The British held the crater and the trenches surrounding it, held the ruins of Hooge village, held the high ground in this sector. The position was valuable, was important tactically, was worth defending. The British forces assigned to hold it understood the importance, understood they were expected to hold, were prepared to defend, were confident in the positions, were confident in the fortifications, were as secure as anyone could be on the Western Front, which was not very secure, but was adequate, was normal, was what soldiers expected. The Western Front in July 1915 was static. The mobile warfare of 1914 was over. The armies had settled into trenches, had created elaborate defensive systems. The trenches ran from the English Channel to the Swiss border. 450 miles of continuous fortifications. Each side held their lines, attacked occasionally, gained ground measured in yards, lost it in counterattacks. The stalemate was complete, was frustrating to both sides. The casualties were continuous, were high, were disproportionate to gains. Artillery killed thousands. Machine guns killed thousands. The attacks that were launched failed mostly, succeeded occasionally at enormous cost. The front barely moved. The war was deadlocked, was wearing, was grinding, was consuming armies without producing decision. Both sides sought breakthrough, sought advantage, sought methods to break the stalemate, to restore mobility, to win. The Ypres salient was particularly contested. The salient was British-held bulge into German lines, extended eastward from Ypres, was vulnerable from three sides, was subjected to artillery fire from north, east, and south, was dangerous position, was costly position. The casualties were continuous. The British held Ypres for multiple reasons. Strategic reasons, symbolic reasons. Determination not to yield Belgian territory. The cost was accepted. The casualties were endured. The salient consumed divisions, consumed lives, consumed morale. Ypres would see 4 major battles during the war, would see unprecedented casualties, would see use of poison gas for the first time, would see innovation after innovation, would see horror after horror, was place where warfare tested its limits, where new weapons were introduced, where new tactics were tried, where the rules of warfare were repeatedly violated. Hooge was part of this, was small section of vast salient, was one position among hundreds, but would become significant, would become site of innovation, would become place where fire became weapon. The British forces holding Hooge in July were from the 41st Brigade, part of the 14th Division. The division was New Army Division, was formed from volunteers who had enlisted in 1914. The men were civilians until recently, had various backgrounds, various professions, had volunteered in enthusiasm of early war, had trained in Britain, had deployed to France, were relatively inexperienced, had seen some combat, had suffered some casualties, but were not hardened veterans, were still learning, were still adapting to Western Front warfare. The specific battalions holding Hooge on July 30th included elements of the 7th King's Royal Rifle Corps, the 8th Rifle Brigade, parts of other units. The soldiers were infantrymen, were riflemen, were typical British soldiers, were adequate, were brave enough, were prepared to do their duty, were expecting to hold the positions, were confident they could defend against attack, were wrong, were unprepared for what was coming, had no concept of fire weapon, had no idea that fire could be projected, could be aimed, could fall into trenches, had no understanding that fire was now weapon, that burning was now tactic, that their instinctive fear of fire would be exploited, would be weaponized, would defeat them. The routine at Hooge was standard for Western Front. The soldiers stood watches, maintained trenches, conducted patrols, endured shelling, suffered casualties from snipers, from artillery, from occasional raids. The casualties were normal, were expected, were manageable. The sector was relatively quiet, was not major offensive area, was holding action. The soldiers waited for relief, waited to be rotated out of line, waited for rest. The waiting was what soldiers did. The enduring was what was required. The holding was the mission. The positions were held. The duties were performed. The routine was maintained. The soldiers at Hooge on July 29th were expecting normal night. Were expecting routine duties. Were expecting to hold positions. Were expecting to be alive on July 31st. Most would be, but some wouldn't. Some would be burned. Some would be casualties of the fire. Some would be among the first to die from flamethrower. Some would be burned at 3:15 a.m., would scream, would die, would become first flamethrower casualties, would become part of history, would become statistics, would become forgotten, would become the burned, the first burned, the ones who died when fire became weapon, when flames appeared, when the threshold was crossed, at Hooge, at the crater. On July 30th, at 3:15 a.m., the crater before the fire, the position before the attack, the moment before knowledge, the soldiers before they learned that fire was now weapon, before they learned to fear flames, before they learned that burning was now possibility, before they learned that modern warfare had turned into fire, the crater before the fire. Waiting, unknowing, about to learn. The development of the flame weapon was German innovation. The concept was old. Fire had been used in warfare for millennia. Greek fire, incendiaries, burning arrows, boiling oil. Fire was ancient weapon. But previous use was simple, was uncontrolled, was fire thrown or poured, was fire as fire, not as projected liquid, not as mechanized weapon, not as tactical tool. The German development was different, was technological, was engineered, was creating device that could project burning liquid, could aim it, could control it, could make fire into weapon that was tactical, that was predictable, that was usable in modern warfare. The history of fire in warfare stretched back to ancient times. The Byzantine Greeks developed Greek fire in the 7th century, was liquid that burned on water, was projected through tubes, was devastating naval weapon. The formula was lost, was secret that died with Byzantine Empire. But the concept persisted. The knowledge that fire could be projected, could be weaponized, could be controlled somewhat. The medieval period saw continued experimentation, saw various forms of incendiaries, of fire weapons, of attempts to harness fire for military purposes. But nothing mechanical, nothing reliable, nothing that was weapon in modern sense. The fire that was used was fire that was thrown, was poured, was dropped, was uncontrolled mostly, was unpredictable, was as dangerous to user as to target often. The ancient and medieval fire weapons that were predecessors, that were inspiration, that showed possibility, but weren't solution, weren't tactical weapons, weren't what the Germans would create. The German designation was Flammenwerfer. The term translated literally as flamethrower, was descriptive, was accurate, was what the device did. Through flames, projected fire. The development occurred before the war began, was not rushed wartime innovation, was deliberate peacetime development. German military engineers worked on the concept from around 1900, worked for over a decade, tested designs, refined mechanisms, solved problems, overcame obstacles. The development was systematic, was thorough, was scientific. The engineers who worked on project were professionals, were trained, were competent, were solving engineering problems, creating mechanisms, designing systems. The work was technical, was detailed, was careful. The flamethrower that emerged was product of years of development, of careful engineering, of systematic refinement, was ready weapon when war began, was proven design, was tested system, was prepared for use. By 1914, the basic design was established, was proven, was ready for production, but wasn't deployed immediately. The German command waited for right moment, waited for right target, waited for right conditions. The weapon was secret, was unknown to enemies. The surprise value was enormous, was critical to effectiveness. The secret had to be preserved. The surprise had to be maintained. The deployment had to be timed correctly, had to be used when impact would be maximum, when psychological effect would be greatest, when tactical advantage would be decisive. The decision to wait, to preserve secret, to time the deployment, was strategic, was calculated, was understanding that first use was critical, was opportunity that came once, was moment that had to matter. The Germans waited through 1914, through most of 1915, until conditions were right, until target was selected, until moment came, until Hooge, until July 30th, until the time was right to unleash fire, to cross threshold, to introduce weapon, to use the Flamethrower in combat for first time. The weapon consisted of several components. Each was necessary, each contributed to function. The combination created capability that didn't exist before, created weapon that made fire tactical. The fuel tank was primary component, was worn on the operator's back, was cylinder, was metal, was constructed carefully, had to withstand pressure, had to contain volatile fuel, had to be durable enough for combat use, had to be light enough to carry. The engineering was precise, was calculated, was solving multiple problems simultaneously. The tank held approximately 12 liters of fuel, was enough for approximately 2 minutes of continuous operation. The capacity was limited by weight, by what operator could carry, by what was practical. 12 liters was compromise, was balance between capacity and portability, between duration and feasibility, was what engineering determined was optimal, was what could work in combat conditions. The fuel itself was critical innovation, was not just gasoline, was not simple liquid, was mixture, was engineered combination, was coal tar and gasoline mixed in specific proportions. The mixture was deliberate. Each component served purpose. The gasoline provided flammability, made the mixture ignite easily, made it burn readily, made it volatile. The coal tar provided viscosity, made the mixture thick, made it sticky, made it cling to surfaces, made it adhere to targets. The combination created fuel that had properties of both. That was flammable like gasoline. That was sticky like tar. That would ignite easily. That would cling to whatever it hit. That would burn intensely. That would burn long. That wouldn't extinguish easily. The fuel that was specifically designed for purpose, for burning enemy soldiers, for burning fortifications, for creating terror, for being weapon. The mixture that was result of experimentation, of testing, of refinement. The fuel that made Flamethrower effective, that made fire weapon work, that made burning tactical. The pressure system was engineering solution to projection problem. How to propel fuel with force, with range, with control. The solution was compressed gas, was nitrogen specifically. The nitrogen was stored in separate cylinder, was also worn on operator's back, was pressurized to high level. The pressure was what propelled fuel, was what gave weapon range, was what made projection possible. The system worked through valve mechanism, through controlled release. The operator controlled valve, controlled flow of nitrogen, controlled pressure applied to fuel. The pressure forced fuel through hose, through nozzle, projected it forward, gave it velocity, gave it range. The engineering was precise, was calculated, was creating system that worked reliably, that could be controlled, that could be aimed, that could project fuel 20 meters, the range that was achieved, that was engineered. that was designed specifically for trench warfare, for crossing no man's land, for reaching enemy trenches. The 20 meters, that was adequate. That was sufficient. That was what was needed. The hose and nozzle assembly was control mechanism, was what made weapon aimable. The hose was flexible, was reinforced, was designed to withstand pressure, to resist heat, to function reliably. Connected fuel tank to nozzle at front. The hose was approximately 3 meters long, was enough to position nozzle away from operator, was enough to aim weapon, was enough to direct fire. The nozzle was critical component, was what shaped stream, what determined pattern, what made fire weapon tactical rather than accident. The nozzle could be adjusted, could create narrow concentrated stream, could create wider spray pattern. The adjustment allowed operator to select, to choose appropriate pattern for target, for situation, for tactical requirement, the concentrated stream for range, for reaching distant target, the spray pattern for covering area, for affecting multiple targets, for creating maximum effect, the nozzle that gave control, that gave precision, that made weapon tactical tool rather than random fire. The ignition system was what created flame, was what transformed liquid into fire. Various methods were used in different models. The early versions used simple method, used burning rag at a nozzle. The rag was soaked in flammable liquid, was ignited before operation, burned continuously. The fuel passing through the burning material ignited, created flame, was reliable method, was simple, required no complex mechanism, but had disadvantages. The burning rag was visible, gave away position, announced weapon. The later versions used improved ignition, used electrical system, used spark mechanism, was more complex, required battery, required electrical components, but was more reliable, was more discreet, could ignite fuel without visible flame before firing. The ignition system that evolved, that improved, that became more sophisticated, that made weapon more effective, more reliable, more tactical. The ignition that was critical, that was what made weapon work, that transformed liquid fuel into projected flame, that made fire weapon possible. The complete apparatus weighed approximately 70 pounds, was heavy burden, was significant weight, was challenging to carry. The weight included everything: fuel tank full of fuel, pressure cylinder full of compressed nitrogen, hose and nozzle assembly, ignition system, all components, all equipment, all necessary elements. The 70 pounds was distributed on operator's back, was worn like backpack, was carried while moving, while fighting, while operating. The burden was exhausting, was limiting, affected mobility, affected endurance, affected capability. The operators had to be strong, had to be fit, had to be capable of carrying weight while functioning in combat, while performing duties, while using weapon. The physical requirement was substantial, was screening factor, was reason not all volunteers were accepted. The burden that was necessary, that was price of portability, that was cost of making weapon man portable. That was what enabled tactical use, that enabled deployment, that made fire weapon practical for trench warfare. The tactical employment was specific, was calculated, was result of understanding weapons' capabilities and limitations. The range of 20 meters determined tactics, determined how weapon was used, determined positioning, determined approach. The flamethrower teams had to get close to targets, had to approach within 20 meters, had to cross no man's land partially, had to position in forward trenches, had to be within range before firing. The approach was dangerous, was exposed, was risky. The teams moved at night usually, moved carefully, moved quietly, positioned themselves before attack, before dawn, before being detected. The positioning that was critical, that determined success, that enabled surprise, that made attack possible, the tactical employment that was practiced, That was rehearsed, that was perfected through training, that was ready for Hooge. For July 30th, for first combat use, the duration of fire was approximately 2 minutes, was limited by fuel capacity, by 12 liters in tank. 2 minutes of continuous firing was not long, was brief, but was enough. Was what analysis determined was sufficient. Was what experience would prove was adequate. 2 minutes to project fire, to create terror, to cause panic, to achieve objective. The duration that was short but sufficient. That was limitation, but acceptable limitation. That was constraint, but workable constraint. The operators understood duration, trained with duration, knew they had 2 minutes, knew they had to achieve effect quickly, had to cause panic rapidly, had to accomplish mission within time limit, then had to withdraw, had to retreat, had to escape before enemy recovered, before counterattack came, before becoming target. The 2 minutes that defined mission, that limited but enabled. That was enough. That was sufficient. That was what made fire weapon tactical, what made flamethrower practical, what made burning possible as military method. The operators were specialists, were selected carefully, were trained extensively. Not all soldiers could use the weapon. Not all were suitable. The physical requirements were first filter, had to be strong enough to carry 70 pounds, had to be fit enough to move with burden, had to have endurance to function under weight. Many were eliminated by physical requirements, couldn't carry weight, couldn't function with burden, couldn't meet standard. Those who passed physical requirements faced evaluation, faced assessment of suitability. The psychological evaluation was critical. The weapon was dangerous. The role was deadly. The operators had to demonstrate psychological fitness, had to show stability, had to prove capability to handle stress, to face danger, to function despite risk, to operate despite knowing they were targets. The evaluation that was thorough, that was necessary. That selected appropriate candidates, that identified those who could do the job, who could function, who could survive possibly, who could be operators. The training was extensive, was detailed, was comprehensive, lasted weeks, covered every aspect of weapon operation, how to wear apparatus correctly, how to distribute weight, how to move with burden, how to maintain balance. The physical training that built strength, that built endurance, that prepared operators for carrying weight in combat. The technical training covered weapon operation, how to control pressure, how to aim nozzle, how to adjust stream pattern, how to ignite fuel, how to maintain weapon, how to perform field repairs, how to troubleshoot problems. The technical knowledge that was essential, that was necessary for reliable operation, that ensured weapon would function when needed. The tactical training covered employment, how to approach targets, how to coordinate with infantry, how to time attacks, how to withdraw after firing, how to survive. The tactics that were developed, that were refined, that were taught, that prepared operators for combat use. For first time. For Hooge. For July 30th. For unleashing fire. The danger to operators was understood, was acknowledged, was part of training. The operators knew they were targets, knew the apparatus was obvious, knew they would be shot at, knew many would die. The acceptance of risk was prerequisite, was required for volunteering, for being accepted, for being trained. The operators who understood risk, who accepted probability of death, who volunteered anyway, were extraordinary, were necessary, were the ones who would carry fire to Hooge, who would unleash flames at 3:15 a.m., who would cross threshold, who would introduce fire weapon, who would change warfare. The operators who were ready, who were trained, who were prepared, who were positioned, who were waiting for the moment, for the order, for the attack, for July 30th, for Hooge, for 3:15 a.m., the weapon that made fire tactical, the Flamethrower that was ready, that was developed, that was refined, That was tested. That was prepared. That was positioned. That was waiting to be unleashed, to cross threshold, to introduce fire, to change warfare, to make fire weapon, the weapon that made fire tactical. Fire is humanity's oldest companion, oldest tool, oldest terror. The relationship with fire is fundamental, is defining, is what made civilization possible. Humans learned to control fire hundreds of thousands of years ago, learned to make it, learned to use it, learned to fear it. The control of fire was breakthrough, was revolution, enabled cooking, enabled warmth, enabled light, enabled protection, enabled progress. Fire made human civilization possible, made survival possible, made everything possible. But fire also killed. Fire destroyed. Fire consumed. The fear of fire was as old as the use of fire, was companion to mastery, was counterpart to control. The fear of fire is primal, is instinctive, is evolutionary. The humans who feared fire survived. The humans who didn't burned. The selection pressure was intense, was absolute. The fear was bred into species, was hardwired into brain, was automatic response, was beyond conscious control. The human who sees fire approaching flees, doesn't decide to flee, doesn't think about fleeing, just flees. The reaction is automatic, is reflexive, is impossible to override through training, through discipline, through courage. The fire comes, the human flees. The reaction is stronger than military discipline, is stronger than orders, is stronger than duty, is primal, is absolute, is what makes fire uniquely terrifying. The flamethrower weaponized this ancient fear, took what was primal, made it modern, mechanized it, made it tactical, made it deliberately employed against enemy. The weapon exploited evolutionary fear, used what couldn't be overcome, used what couldn't be resisted, used what made humans flee regardless of training, regardless of courage, regardless of intention. The flamethrower was psychological weapon as much as physical weapon, was terror weapon more than killing weapon. The fire that was projected wasn't random, wasn't accident, was aimed, was controlled, was deliberate, was fire as weapon, was fire as tactic, was fire as method of defeating enemy, of breaking will, of creating panic, of causing flight. The ancient fear made modern, made tactical, made weapon. The difference from other weapons was fundamental. Bullets killed quickly, shells killed quickly, even gas killed eventually, but none created instant flight. None created panic that spread like contagion. None exploited fear that was primal, that was instinctive, that was impossible to overcome. The soldier who heard bullets could stay in position, could fight, could function. The training overcame fear, the discipline held, the courage sustained, but the soldier who saw fire coming couldn't stay, couldn't fight, couldn't function. The primal fear took over, the evolutionary response activated. The flight was automatic, was beyond control, was impossible to prevent. The fire that came, the human who fled, the ancient pattern, the evolutionary response, made into weapon, made into tactic, made into method of warfare. Burning was uniquely horrible, was understood to be horrible, was known to be worst way to die. The pain of burning was extreme, was beyond other pain, was agony that was total. The burns destroyed tissue, destroyed nerve endings, created pain that was overwhelming, that was unbearable, that was beyond human tolerance. The soldiers knew this, knew that burning was worst fate, was death that was most feared, was suffering that exceeded all other suffering. The knowledge contributed to terror, the knowledge that fire meant burning, that burning meant agony, that agony would be prolonged, that death would be slow, that suffering would be extreme. The knowledge amplified fear, made fire even more terrifying, made flight even more automatic, made panic even more total. The fire that was weapon was also spectacle. The flames were visible, were bright, were orange, were flickering. The light illuminated battlefield, made darkness into day locally. The flames were beautiful in terrible way, were mesmerizing, were hypnotic, were impossible to ignore. The human eye was drawn to fire, was programmed to watch fire, to track fire, to be alert to fire. The attention was automatic, was evolutionary. The flames that appeared commanded attention, dominated vision, dominated consciousness. The spectacle contributed to terror. The flames that were seen, that were tracked, that were watched, that announced death, that showed what was coming, that revealed the horror, the spectacle of fire, the vision of flames, the orange light in darkness, the flickering illumination, the beautiful, terrible sight of fire as weapon, the spectacle that terrorized, that mesmerized, that dominated, that contributed to panic, that contributed to flight, that contributed to defeat. The sound of fire was distinctive, was roaring, was rushing, was whooshing. The sound was loud, was clear, was recognizable, was unlike any other weapon sound. The artillery roared, the machine guns chattered, the rifles cracked, each weapon had sound, had signature. The flamethrower had its own, had roar, had rush, had whoosh. The sound that announced fire was coming, that warned of flames, that preceded the burning. The sound became feared, became recognized, became associated with terror. The soldiers who heard the roar knew what it meant. New fire was coming, new flames would follow, new to flee. The sound that was signature, that was warning, that was announcement of horror. The sound of fire, the acoustic signature of burning, the noise that meant modern warfare had turned into fire. The sound that would become familiar, that would become feared, that would become part of warfare's soundscape. That began at Hooge, that was first heard at 3:15 a.m. That announced that fire was now weapon. The marriage of ancient and modern was what made Flamethrower uniquely effective. Was old fear applied through new technology? Was primal terror delivered through industrial weapon? Was evolutionary response exploited by mechanized device? The combination was powerful, was effective beyond expectations, was successful beyond hopes. The weapon that took what humans feared most deeply, what was hardwired into brain, what couldn't be overcome, and made it tactical, made it weapon, made it method. The ancient fear made modern, made tactical, made weapon. The flamethrower that was old and new, that was primal and industrial, that was fear and technology. That was ancient terror delivered through modern method. That changed warfare. That crossed threshold. That made fire weapon. That turned modern warfare into fire. The ancient fear made modern. The primal terror made tactical. The evolutionary response made weapon. At Hooge, at 3:15 a.m., July 30th, 1915. When the ancient fear met modern warfare, when fire became weapon, when the threshold was crossed, the ancient fear made modern. The German preparations began hours before the attack. The flamethrower teams were moved into position in the afternoon, were positioned in forward trenches, in positions close to British lines, within attacking range, within the 20 meters that the weapon could project. The positioning was careful, was deliberate, was secret. The British couldn't know, couldn't suspect. The surprise was essential, was critical to success. The flamethrower teams moved quietly, moved carefully, positioned themselves, prepared the weapons, checked the fuel, checked the pressure, checked the ignition, made sure everything worked, made sure everything was ready. The teams waited, remained concealed, remained silent, waited for the order, waited for the moment, waited for 3:15 a.m. The German infantry was positioned behind the flamethrower teams, was ready to follow, was prepared to exploit the attack, to advance through positions that would be abandoned, to occupy trenches that would be empty, to capture objectives without fighting. The infantry understood the plan, knew the flamethrower teams would attack first, knew they would follow, knew they would advance into chaos, into panic, into defeat. The infantry was ready, was prepared, was waiting. The coordination was planned, was practiced, was essential. The flamethrower attack would create opportunity. The infantry would exploit opportunity, would capture objectives, would achieve victory. The coordination between flamethrowers and infantry was what made attack effective, was what made the tactic work, was what would prove that fire was weapon, that terror was method, that panic could be created and exploited. The German artillery was prepared, was positioned, was aimed, was ready to fire. The artillery would begin the attack, would bombard British positions, would create conditions for the flamethrower assault, would isolate the attack area, would prevent reinforcement, would prevent counterattack. The artillery barrage would be heavy, would be sustained, would be longer than usual, would make British take shelter, would make them expect conventional infantry attack, would set conditions for surprise, for shock, for the unexpected appearance of flames. The artillery was essential, was first phase, was preparation, was creating conditions, was making success possible. The artillery crews waited, were ready, were prepared to fire, waited for the order, waited for the time, waited for the moment to begin. The darkness was deliberate. The timing of 3:15 a.m. was calculated, was chosen for specific reasons. The darkness made the flames more visible, made them more dramatic, made them more terrifying. The orange flames in black night were shocking, were stunning, were impossible to ignore. The darkness made defense more difficult, made coordination harder, made response slower, made confusion greater. The darkness helped the attack, helped the surprise, helped the terror. The timing was optimal, was perfect for the weapon, for the tactic, for the psychological effect. The darkness that would be penetrated by flames, that would be illuminated by fire, that would become stage for terror. The darkness before 3:15 a.m., the darkness that waited, the darkness that would be transformed by fire, by orange light, by flickering illumination, the darkness that was part of plan. That was part of attack, that was part of weapons effectiveness. The British had no indication, had no warning, had no suspicion. The day of July 29th was normal. The evening was routine. The night began as nights began. The troops stood normal watches, conducted normal duties, expected normal night. The intelligence had detected nothing. The patrols had seen nothing. The observation had noted nothing. The British had no concept that fire weapon existed, had no knowledge that flamethrower was deployed, had no understanding that fire could be projected, could be aimed, could fall into trenches. The British were completely unprepared, were utterly surprised, were about to experience something they couldn't anticipate, couldn't imagine, couldn't prepare for. The ignorance was complete, was total, was about to be shattered, about to be replaced by knowledge, by terror, by understanding that fire was now weapon, that burning was now possibility, that modern warfare had added fire to its methods. The hours before midnight were quiet, were normal. The troops in the trenches at Hooge conducted routine duties. Some slept, some stood watch, some maintained equipment, some wrote letters, some talked quietly, some smoked, some just waited, waited for relief, waited for dawn, waited for whatever would come. The routine was established, was familiar, was comfortable in sense that anything could be comfortable on Western Front. The troops didn't expect attack, didn't feel threatened particularly, felt as safe as anyone felt in trenches, which wasn't very safe, but was normal, was known, was manageable. The hours passed. Midnight came. The early morning hours began. The troops changed watches. Some slept, some woke. The routine continued. The night progressed. The countdown to 3:15 continued. Unknown, unrecognized, inevitable. The German final preparations began after midnight. The flamethrower operators checked equipment one last time, checked fuel levels, checked pressure, checked ignition, made final adjustments, made final preparations. The operators were tense, were focused, were preparing mentally. The mission was dangerous, was likely to be deadly. The operators knew they were priority targets, knew they would be shot at, knew many wouldn't survive. The preparation was physical and mental, was checking equipment and stealing nerve, was making ready externally and internally. The operators waited, remained concealed, remained quiet, watched the time, watched for the signal, watched for the moment. The countdown continued. 3 a.m. 3:15 approached. The moment approached. The threshold approached. The operators waited, ready, prepared, about to unleash fire, about to cross threshold, about to change warfare, about to introduce fire as weapon, about to create terror, about to defeat enemy through panic, about to prove that fire was tactical, was weapon, was method. The operators waited. The moment approached. The countdown continued. The artillery opened fire at 2:55 a.m. The bombardment began. The shells fell on British positions, fell on trenches, fell on communication lines, fell on rear areas. The bombardment was intense, was heavy, was sustained. The British troops took shelter, went to dugouts, waited for bombardment to end. The pattern was familiar, was expected. Artillery followed by infantry. The troops prepared mentally, prepared to defend, to fight, to repel the attack that would come. The bombardment continued. The shells fell. The explosions were continuous, were deafening, were terrifying in their own way, but were known terror, were familiar horror, were what soldiers expected, were what soldiers had learned to endure. The bombardment continued. The troops waited. The time passed. 3 a.m., 3:10, 3:15 approached. The bombardment continued. The troops waited, ready, prepared, expecting infantry, about to experience fire instead, about to see flames, about to learn new terror, about to discover that fire was weapon. The night before the fire, the hours before the flames, the moments before knowledge. The countdown to 3:15 a.m. The preparation that was German, the ignorance that was British, the moment that approached, the threshold that would be crossed. The night before modern warfare turned into fire. The hours before Hooge became place where fire was unleashed, where flames appeared, where terror spread, where threshold was crossed. The night before, the preparation, the positioning, the countdown, the approach to moment, to 3:15 a.m. to July 30th, to the instant when everything would change, when fire would appear, when flames would fall, when terror would spread, when threshold would be crossed. The night before the fire, the artillery stopped at 3:14 a.m. The sudden silence was shocking. The British troops emerged from dugouts immediately, moved to firing positions. The drill was automatic, was practiced, was what soldiers did. The bombardment stops, the infantry comes, the defense begins. The troops moved into position, grabbed weapons, peered into darkness, looked for targets, looked for the attack. The smoke from artillery obscured vision. The darkness was total. The visibility was meters. The troops waited, alert, tense, ready. The seconds passed. 1 minute after the bombardment stopped. Where was the attack? Where were the Germans? The troops strained to see, to hear, to detect movement. The tension mounted. The waiting stretched. Something was wrong. Something was different. This wasn't the normal pattern. The attack should have come, should be visible, should be happening. But nothing. Just darkness. Just silence. Just waiting. Then the first flame appeared. Emerged from darkness 60 meters away, a stream of fire, orange, bright, arcing through the night. The troops stared. stared, couldn't process what they were seeing. What was this? Fire, liquid fire, projected fire, flying fire. The stream arced, rose, fell, came toward them. The troops watched, frozen, mesmerized, horrified. The stream fell, landed in trench 40 meters to the left. The fire splashed, spread, clung to sandbags, to wooden supports, to equipment, to ground. Burned. The flame illuminated that section of trench. Orange light, flickering, revealing. The troops there screamed, tried to avoid the fire. Couldn't. The fire spread, covered everything, covered some of them. The screaming intensified, became agony, became sound that was inhuman, was beyond what humans should make, was sound of burning, of agony, of death. More flames appeared, multiple streams, from multiple positions, arcing through darkness, falling into trenches, into different sections, into positions along the line. The flames appeared simultaneously, appeared coordinated, were coordinated. 5 streams, 6 streams, 7, all appearing at once, all arcing, all falling, all burning. The light was intense, was multiple sources, was orange glow that illuminated the battlefield, that revealed the trenches, that showed what was happening, that made the horror visible. The troops saw flames falling, saw fire spreading, saw men burning, saw sections of trench becoming inferno, saw something they had never imagined, had never conceived was possible, saw fire as weapon, saw flames projected, saw burning made tactical, saw horror made method. The sound was overwhelming, the roaring of multiple flamethrowers, the rushing of propelled fuel, the whooshing of ignition, the sound of fire burning, the sound of men screaming, the sound combined, created cacophony, created acoustic horror. The troops heard the roaring, heard the burning, heard the screaming. The sound was as terrifying as the sight. Was evidence of horror? Was proof of something new, something worse, something beyond what they knew. The sound that would become signature, that would become feared, that would become associated with flamethrower, that would be remembered, that would haunt. The sound of fire as weapon, the sound of projected flames, the sound of burning made tactical, the sound at Hooge. At 3:15 a.m., the sound when fire appeared, when threshold was crossed, when modern warfare turned into fire. The panic began instantly. The troops who saw flames coming didn't hesitate, didn't think, didn't decide, just reacted, just fled. The reaction was automatic, was primal, was evolutionary. The fire came. The humans fled. The instinct was absolute, was impossible to resist. The training meant nothing. The discipline meant nothing. The duty meant nothing. The fire meant everything. The fear meant everything. The instinct meant everything. The troops fled. Dropped weapons, abandoned positions, ran toward rear, ran away from fire, away from flames, away from burning, away from terror. The flight was immediate, was total, was uncontrollable. The troops who saw flames ran. The troops who didn't see flames heard the screaming, heard the commotion, heard others running, ran themselves. The panic spread like fire, spread faster than fire, spread instantly, spread completely. The contagion was total. The panic infected everyone, infected those who saw flames, infected those who didn't, infected those who heard screaming, infected those who saw others fleeing. The fear spread from man to man, from section to section, from position to position. Within seconds, the entire defensive line was panicking, was fleeing, was abandoning positions. The trenches emptied. Dozens of men, hundreds of men, all running, all fleeing, all seeking safety, seeking distance, seeking escape. The flight was chaotic, was desperate, was total. The men who had sworn to hold, who had been prepared to fight, who had been confident, were running, were defeated, were routed, Not by destruction, by terror, not by casualties, by fear, not by force, by panic. The fire that killed few, the panic that defeated many, the terror that accomplished what conventional weapons couldn't, what months of artillery hadn't, what repeated attacks hadn't. The flames that appeared for 2 minutes, the panic that emptied positions completely, the terror that was weapon. That was tactic. That was method. The officers tried to stop the flight, tried desperately. Lieutenant Morrison of the 7th Rifle Corps stood in communication trench, blocked the path, shouted orders, stop, stand, hold. The men ignored him, pushed past, continued running. Morrison grabbed fleeing soldiers, tried to physically stop them, was pushed aside, was ignored, was ineffective. Captain Williams tried the same, shouted himself hoarse, ordered men to stop, to return, to hold positions. Nothing worked. The men wouldn't stop, couldn't stop. The fear was too great. The instinct was too strong. The panic was too total. The officers were overwhelmed, were swept along, were unable to restore order, were unable to control their men, were witnesses to complete collapse, to total defeat, to rout. The officers who tried, who failed, who couldn't prevent what instinct demanded, what fear required, what panic created. The flight that couldn't be stopped, the rout that couldn't be prevented. The defeat that was total, that was instant, that was accomplished in minutes, in the time it took for flames to appear, for panic to spread, for flight to empty the trenches. The German infantry advanced, moved forward cautiously, expected resistance, expected fighting, found none, found empty trenches, found abandoned positions, found weapons dropped on ground, found equipment scattered, found evidence of flight, of panic, of rout. The German soldiers were shocked, were surprised, were unprepared for this, expected hard fight, expected casualties, found victory without cost, found objectives achieved without combat. The infantry moved through trenches, occupied positions, secured objectives, reached the crater, found it abandoned, occupied it, captured it. The mission was complete. The attack was successful. The objectives were achieved. In 15 minutes, from 3:15 to 3:30, 15 minutes to accomplish what months had failed to accomplish. 15 minutes to prove that fire was weapon, that terror was tactic, that panic could defeat armies. That flamethrower worked. That fire was now part of warfare. That threshold was crossed. That modern warfare had turned into fire. The burning continued after the panic. The men who were struck by fire, who were covered in fuel, who were burning, continued screaming, continued dying. The fire wouldn't extinguish, was designed not to extinguish, clung to clothing, to skin, to everything, burned until fuel was consumed. Until nothing remained to burn, the men who were burning tried to remove clothing, tried to beat out flames, tried to escape the fire. Couldn't. The fire clung. The fire burned. The fire consumed. The screaming continued, was heard across the battlefield, was heard by fleeing British, was heard by advancing Germans, was heard by everyone, was evidence of horror, was proof of what fire weapon did, was sound that would be remembered. That would haunt, that would become part of what Hooge meant, what flamethrower meant, what fire as weapon meant. The screaming of the burning, the agony of those struck by flames, the sound of death by fire, the sound at Hooge, the sound at 3:15 a.m., the sound when fire appeared, when flames fell, when men burned, when threshold was crossed, when modern warfare turned into fire, the attack at Hooge, the flames that appeared, the panic that spread, the flight that emptied trenches, the victory that was instant, the success that was total, the weapon that was proven, the threshold that was crossed, the fire that was unleashed at 3:15 a.m. at Hooge. July 30th, 1915. The attack, the fire, the panic, the defeat, the threshold. The moment when modern warfare turned into fire. The men who were struck directly by the flaming fuel experienced horror that was immediate and total. The liquid fire landed on them, came from above, arced through darkness, fell from sky seemingly. The first contact was liquid, was wet, was soaking. The fuel that hit was thick, was viscous, was not like water, was heavier, was stickier, was coating. The soldiers who were struck felt wetness first, felt liquid covering them, soaking into uniform, spreading across fabric. The moment of contact before ignition, the second before burning began, the instant when fuel covered but hadn't ignited yet, was moment of confusion, of incomprehension. What was this liquid? Why was liquid falling? What was happening? The confusion that lasted second, maybe 2 seconds. Then the ignition. Then the fire. Then everything changed. The fuel ignited, burst into flame. The combustion was instant, was total. The fuel that covered them burned. The clothing soaked in fuel burned. The skin beneath burned. Everything burned. The ignition was not gradual, was not spreading flame, was instant combustion, was everything burning at once. The fuel that was designed to ignite readily, that was engineered to burn completely. That was mixture of gasoline and coal tar that combined flammability with adhesion, that ignited easily, that clung to surfaces, that burned intensely, that was burning them now, that was consuming them, that was killing them, the ignition that transformed wetness into flame, that transformed confusion into agony, that transformed soldiers into burning men, into casualties, into victims, into the dying. The pain came with the burning, came as wave, as overwhelming sensation, as experience that was total, that was consuming, that was beyond anything they had known, beyond anything they had imagined, beyond anything humans should experience. The pain of burning was unique, was different from gunshot pain, from shrapnel pain, from any other combat wound, was more intense, was more total, was more overwhelming. The nerve endings in skin were destroyed by heat. But before destruction came stimulation, came maximum stimulation, came pain signal at maximum intensity. The nerves that were burning sent pain signals, sent maximum signals, sent overwhelming signals to brain. The brain that received signals, that processed pain, that experienced agony, that was overwhelmed by intensity, by totality, by absoluteness of pain. The pain that was everything, that was all-consuming, that was beyond tolerance, beyond endurance, beyond what could be borne. The screaming was reflexive, was involuntary, was beyond control. The men who were burning screamed, couldn't not scream, couldn't suppress the sound, couldn't remain silent. The pain was too great, the agony was too intense, the suffering was too total. The scream came automatically, came from depth, came from place beyond consciousness, beyond control, was primal response, was expression of agony beyond words, beyond language, beyond communication. Was sound that was pure suffering, that was pure pain, that was pure horror. The screaming that was loud, that was piercing, that carried across battlefield, that was heard by everyone, by other soldiers, by operators, by commanders, by medical personnel, by everyone who was present. The screaming that couldn't be ignored, that couldn't be tuned out, that penetrated consciousness, that forced attention, that made horror audible, that made suffering known, that made agony public. The sound of the screaming was distinctive, was different from other combat sounds, was different from the yelling of advancing troops, from the shouting of orders, from the cursing of wounded, was different in quality, in intensity, in character. Was sound that was recognizable, was sound that was unmistakable, was sound of burning, of men on fire, of agony that was unique, that was specific, that was created only by burning. The experienced soldiers who heard burning screams recognized them, knew what they meant, knew what was happening, New men were burning, the sound that would become familiar, that would become recognized, that would become associated with flamethrowers, with fire weapons, with burning, the sound that would haunt, that would be remembered, that would recur in nightmares, that would last in memory, the screaming of burning men. The sound at Hooge, the sound at 3:15 a.m., the sound when fire became weapon, the sound that would continue, that would be heard at every flamethrower attack, at every burning, at every use of fire weapon, the sound that began at Hooge, that would continue through wars, through decades, through generations, the screaming of the burning. The men tried desperately to extinguish flames, tried everything, tried instinctively, tried frantically, tried with desperation of dying men, beat at flames with hands, the hands that burned too, that were covered in fuel too, that were on fire too, beat uselessly at flames that wouldn't extinguish, that wouldn't go out, that wouldn't stop burning, tried to remove clothing, tore at uniforms, tried to strip off burning fabric, the fabric that was soaked in fuel, that was burning, that was melting, that was adhering to skin, that came off with skin sometimes, that tore flesh, that made horror worse. The attempts to remove clothing that failed, that caused more damage, that increased suffering, tried to roll on ground, to smother flames, to deprive fire of oxygen, the method that worked for normal fire. That didn't work for fuel fire, for chemical fire, for fire that was designed to resist extinguishing, the rolling that was instinctive, that was desperate, that was futile, that accomplished nothing, that didn't stop burning, that didn't extinguish flames, that didn't save them. The fuel was designed to resist extinguishing, was engineered specifically for this. The coal tar made it thick, made it sticky, made it cling, made it impossible to remove by shaking, by beating, by rolling. The fuel that stuck to surfaces, that adhered to clothing, to skin, to anything it touched, the fuel that remained, that burned where it landed, that continued burning until consumed, until fuel was depleted, until nothing remained to burn. The design that was deliberate, that was calculated, that was intentional. The fuel that was weapon, that was tool, that was method of killing, of causing suffering, of creating terror. The fuel that worked as designed, that performed as engineered, that burned as intended, that killed as planned. The fuel that wouldn't extinguish, that resisted all attempts, that burned despite everything, that consumed, that destroyed, that killed. The other soldiers tried to help sometimes, tried to assist burning comrades, approached burning men, tried to help extinguish flames, tried to beat out fire, tried to remove burning clothing, tried to do something, the attempts that were brave, that were compassionate, that were often futile, that were sometimes fatal. The helpers who touched burning men sometimes caught fire themselves. The fuel that transferred, that spread, that ignited on helpers, that burned them too. The fire that was contagious, that was spreadable, that was danger to anyone who approached. The helpers who were burned trying to help, who became casualties themselves, who added to toll, who increased suffering, the helping that was instinct, that was compassion, that was humanity. But that was dangerous, that was deadly sometimes, that created more casualties, that made horror worse. The attempts to help, that failed, that couldn't succeed, that couldn't save, that couldn't stop burning, that could only add to casualties, to suffering, to death. The burns themselves were severe, were extensive, were catastrophic. The fuel covered large areas of body. The face often, the hands always, the torso, the back, the legs, wherever fuel landed, wherever fuel soaked, wherever fuel burned. The coverage was extensive, was over a large percentage of body surface. The burns that covered were burns that killed. The percentage of body burned determined survival. Above 30% was often fatal. Above 50% was almost always fatal. The burns from flamethrower often exceeded 50%. often exceeded 70%, were burns that were incompatible with life, that were fatal inevitably. That meant death was coming, was just question of when, of how long suffering would last, of how long until death came as relief. The extensive burns, the coverage that was too much, that was beyond survivability, that meant death was certain, was just matter of time. The depth of burns was severe, were not first degree, were not superficial, were third degree, were full thickness, were destruction of all layers of skin, were burning through epidermis, through dermis, into tissue beneath, into muscle sometimes, into bone sometimes. The burns that destroyed everything, that carbonized tissue, that charred flesh, that left nothing. The depth that was result of heat intensity, of fuel that burned at high temperature, of flame that was concentrated, of burning that continued, that persisted, that consumed everything. The depth of burns that determined survival, that determined outcome, that made prognosis. The third-degree burns that were non-survivable often, that destroyed tissue beyond repair, beyond healing, beyond recovery. The burns that meant death, that meant suffering, that meant agony that would continue until death came. The depth of burning, the extent of destruction, the severity that was extreme. That was maximum. That was worst possible. The burns from Flamethrower, the burns at Hooge, the burns when fire became weapon. The immediate effects were shock and pain. The shock was physiological, was body's response to massive trauma, to extensive injury, to overwhelming insult. The blood pressure dropped, the heart rate increased, the breathing became rapid, the body's attempt to compensate, to maintain, to survive. The shock that was response, that was automatic, that was body fighting to live. But also shock that was progressive, that worsened, that led to collapse, to failure, to death if untreated. The shock that was immediate danger, that killed quickly sometimes, that killed before infection, before complications, before anything else. The shock that was first killer, first danger, first threat to survival. The shock that medical personnel fought, that they tried to prevent, that they tried to treat, but often couldn't reverse, often couldn't overcome. The shock that killed, that contributed to death, that made survival less likely. The pain continued, didn't diminish, didn't reduce, continued at intensity, at maximum, at unbearable level. The pain that didn't stop, that didn't ease, that was constant, that was unrelenting, that was torture. The burned men who experienced this, who suffered this, who endured this, couldn't rest, couldn't sleep, couldn't escape, could only experience pain, could only suffer, could only endure. The pain that was everything, that was total experience, that was all there was. The pain that was beyond morphine often, beyond medication, beyond relief. The pain that continued, that persisted, that lasted. Until nerve endings were finally destroyed, until tissue was dead, until sensation stopped. But that took time, took hours, took days sometimes. Until then was pain, was constant pain, was unrelenting pain, was agony. The suffering of burned men, the experience that was horror, that was beyond description, that was beyond imagination. That was what fire weapon created, what Flamethrower caused, what burning meant. The medical response began immediately when possible. The medical personnel moved forward as quickly as conditions allowed, found the burned men, found casualties unlike anything they had seen, unlike anything they had trained for. The medics had experience with gunshot wounds, with shrapnel wounds, with gas casualties, but not with burns, not with extensive burns, not with burns of this severity. The training hadn't covered this, the preparation hadn't included this, the experience hadn't taught this. The medics faced casualties they didn't know how to treat, didn't know how to help, didn't know what to do. The helplessness was immediate, was total, was overwhelming. The medics who wanted to help Who tried to help? Who didn't know how? The first aid for burns in 1915 was minimal, was primitive, was inadequate. The medical knowledge was limited. The understanding of burns was basic. The treatments available were few. Remove burned clothing if possible, was first step, was immediate action, but was dangerous. The clothing that was burned, that was melted, that was fused to skin, that couldn't be removed without removing skin, that couldn't be taken off without causing more damage. The removal that was necessary, that was part of treatment, but that caused pain, that caused injury, that made things worse sometimes. The medics who tried, who were careful, who were gentle, who still caused pain, who still caused damage, who couldn't avoid it. Cover wounds if possible, was second step, was next action. But with what? The bandages were inadequate, were too small, the burns were too extensive, required too much coverage, required dressings that didn't exist, that weren't available, that weren't part of medical supplies. The medics improvised, used whatever was available, used field dressings, used cloth, used anything, the covering that was inadequate. That was insufficient. That didn't protect. That didn't help enough. That was better than nothing. But only barely. The covering that was done. That was attempted. That was inadequate. That showed limitations. That showed helplessness. That showed that medicine couldn't help, couldn't save, couldn't treat effectively. Administer morphine if available, was third step, was pain management, was only real help that could be given. The morphine that dulled pain somewhat, that reduced suffering somewhat, that made bearable what was unbearable. The morphine that was limited, that was rationed, that was insufficient, that wasn't enough for everyone. For all burned men, for all who needed. The choices that had to be made. Who received morphine, who didn't, who was priority, who was hopeless. The triage that was necessary. That was horrible. That was choosing. The medics who gave morphine, who administered relief, who helped what little they could, who knew it wasn't enough, who knew men were dying, who knew they couldn't save them, who gave morphine anyway, who tried anyway, who did what they could even knowing it was insufficient. Transport to aid station was final step, was getting casualties to rear, to medical facilities, to doctors, to hope of treatment. The transportation that was necessary, that was standard procedure. That was protocol, but that was agony for burned men. The movement caused pain. The touching caused pain. The stretcher ride caused pain. Every bump, every jostle, every movement caused pain that was extreme. That was unbearable. That made journey torture. The burned men who screamed during transport, who begged for it to stop, who begged for death sometimes, who begged for end to suffering. The transportation that was necessary, that had to be done. That was part of treatment. But that was agony. That was suffering. That was torture in itself. The journey to aid station, to medical care, to hope of survival. That was ordeal. That was horror. That was part of suffering. That added to agony. That made experience worse. The aid stations were overwhelmed, were unprepared, were inadequate for burn casualties. The doctors at aid stations had no special burn training, had no experience with extensive burns, had no protocols, had no procedures, had standard trauma training, had battlefield medicine experience, but not burn experience. Not this. The doctors who examined burned men, who assessed injuries, who determined treatment, who had no treatment to give, really, who could only stabilize, could only provide morphine, could only bandage inadequately, could only send further back to hospitals, to facilities that might have capability, that might have knowledge, that might be able to help. The aid stations that were waypoint, that were intermediary, that were step toward real care, but that couldn't provide care themselves, that could only assess, could only stabilize, could only send onward. The aid stations where burned men stopped briefly, where they were seen, where they were helped minimally, where they continued suffering, where they continued dying, where they were sent onward, to hospitals, to hope, to treatment, to whatever awaited. The hospitals received burn casualties, received injuries they weren't equipped for, weren't prepared for, weren't capable of treating effectively. The burn treatment in 1915 was primitive by modern standards, was based on limited understanding, was using methods that barely worked. That had limited effectiveness. That saved few. That lost most. The hospitals that tried, that did their best, that provided what care was possible, but that couldn't save most burned men. That couldn't prevent most deaths. That couldn't ease most suffering. The hospitals where burned men were treated, where they suffered, where most died, where few survived, where the limits of medicine were stark, where the inadequacy was obvious, where the helplessness was total. The hospitals where burned men from Hooge went, where first flamethrower casualties were taken, where they received care, where most died, where suffering continued, where horror persisted, until death came, until suffering ended, until agony ceased. The hospitals where burned men died, where first casualties of fire weapon perished, where suffering ended finally, where death came as relief, as mercy, as end. The hospitals, the treatment, the care, the death, the end of suffering, the end of burning, the end. The British response to the panic was initially confused. The fleeing troops reached rear areas, reached reserve positions, reached command posts, still running, still panicked, still terrified. The officers in rear areas tried to understand what had happened, tried to get coherent reports, tried to determine what was occurring. The fleeing troops couldn't explain clearly, spoke of fire, of flames from nowhere, of liquid fire falling from sky, of burning, of men screaming, of terror, of death. The reports made no sense, made no clear picture. The officers didn't understand, didn't comprehend, didn't know about flamethrowers, didn't know fire weapon existed, couldn't process what they were being told. Thought the troops were mistaken, were exaggerating, were confused. The reality was too strange, was too new, was too unexpected. The officers who heard the reports, who tried to understand, who couldn't quite believe, who were about to learn that fire was now weapon. The reorganization took hours. The fleeing troops had to be stopped, had to be gathered, had to be reformed into units. The process was slow, was difficult. The men were traumatized, were still terrified, were resistant to returning. The officers worked through the early morning, gathered men, reformed companies, restored some order. The NCOs were critical, were experienced, knew the men, could influence them, could convince them to stop, to reform, to prepare to counterattack. The process was gradual, was measured. By dawn, the troops were reorganized, were formed into coherent units, were ready to be used, were not ready psychologically, were still shaken, were still afraid, but were organized, were capable of being employed, were available for counterattack. The counterattacks began in the morning, were launched at dawn, were intended to retake the positions, to recapture the crater, to restore the line. The British forces attacked, advanced toward Hooge, met German resistance. The Germans had fortified the captured positions, had prepared defenses, were ready. The British attacks were repulsed, were stopped, were defeated. The casualties were heavy. The attacks failed, were tried again. Same result. Repulsed. Heavy casualties. Failure. The British tried repeatedly. Through the morning, through the afternoon. Each attack failed. Each attack cost casualties. Each attack accomplished nothing. The Germans held. The positions weren't retaken. The crater remained German. The British eventually accepted the loss. Stopped the attacks. Established new line further back. Accepted that the ground was gone. That the positions were lost. That the crater was German now. The acceptance came after hundreds of casualties, after repeated failures, after exhausting attempts. The acceptance that was difficult, that was bitter, that was cost of the fire attack, of the flamethrower, of the panic, of the flight. The casualties from the actual attack were not high by Western Front standards. The men killed, by fire, numbered perhaps 25, perhaps 30. The exact number was uncertain. Some bodies were burned, were unidentifiable. Some wounded died later, were counted as wounded then as dead. The total killed by fire directly was fewer than 50. Was small number, was tiny compared to casualties from artillery battles, from major offensives, from gas attacks, but the casualties from fire were qualitatively different, were more horrible, were more traumatic, were deaths that were more feared, more remembered, more impactful despite smaller numbers. The quality of death mattered. The horror mattered. The suffering mattered. The small number who burned mattered more than the statistics suggested. Mattered because of how they died, because of what they suffered, because of what they represented. The burning deaths that were few, that were horrible, that were remembered, that mattered beyond their number. The psychological casualties were far greater. The hundreds who fled, who panicked, who abandoned positions, were casualties in psychological sense, were traumatized, were shaken, were changed. The men who saw flames, who heard the screaming, who fled in terror, were marked by experience, were affected permanently. Some recovered, returned to duty, functioned adequately. Others didn't, were transferred, were invalided out, were broken by the experience, by the fear, by the panic, by the memory. The psychological toll was substantial, was greater than physical toll, was harder to measure, harder to quantify, but was real, was significant, was cost of the fire weapon, of the terror tactic, of the panic that was created deliberately. That was a weapon as much as the fire, the psychological casualties that numbered hundreds, that cost the army, that weakened the force, that were effect of flamethrower, that were intended effect, that proved the weapon worked, that proved terror was tactic, that proved fire was weapon not just for killing, but for breaking, for defeating, for causing collapse without destruction. The psychological casualties, the hidden cost, the unmeasured toll, the hundreds affected, changed, traumatized, broken by fire, by flames, by burning, by terror at Hooge. On July 30th, the aftermath, the cost, the casualties seen and unseen, physical and psychological, immediate and lasting, the price of fire weapon. The tactical result was German success. The positions were captured, the crater was taken, the objectives were achieved, the cost was minimal. The German casualties were light, the flamethrower operators survived mostly, were not killed during attack, were not targeted effectively, were successful, were vindicated. The infantry that followed suffered few casualties, advanced easily, occupied positions without fighting. The tactical success was complete, was total, was proof that flamethrower worked, that fire was effective weapon, that terror could defeat, that panic could accomplish what force couldn't. The German command was pleased, was impressed, was convinced. The weapon would be used again, would be deployed more widely, would become standard, would be produced in greater numbers, would be issued to more units. The success at Hooge guaranteed proliferation, guaranteed that fire would spread, that flamethrower would become part of German arsenal, part of German tactics, part of how war was fought. The tactical success that had strategic implications, that changed warfare, that introduced fire, that crossed threshold, the success at Hooge, the victory through fire, the triumph of terror, the proof that weapon worked. The British response was organizational, was tactical, was practical. The fire weapon was analyzed, was studied, was understood finally. The reports were compiled. The witnesses were interviewed, the mechanism was explained, the flamethrower was described, was understood as a weapon, as device, as tactical tool. The British understanding came after experience, came after being attacked, came after seeing what fire weapon did. The understanding led to changes, to preparations, to countermeasures. The troops were told about flamethrowers, were warned, were taught what to expect, were instructed how to respond, to shoot the operators, to target the fuel tanks, to avoid panic, to hold positions. The training that came after Hooge, after the first attack, after the lesson was learned. The training that would help, that would reduce effectiveness, that would make subsequent attacks less successful, but couldn't eliminate the fear, couldn't eliminate the terror, couldn't eliminate the primal response to fire. The training that helped, that prepared, but that couldn't fully counter, couldn't fully protect, couldn't fully prevent panic when fire appeared, when flames fell, when burning started. The training that was response, that was adaptation, that was learning, that came from Hooge, from July 30th, from the night when fire was first unleashed, from the attack that taught the lesson, that showed what fire weapon was, what it could do, what it meant, the aftermath at Hooge, the response, the reorganization, the counterattacks, the casualties, the lessons, the changes, the adaptation, the understanding that came after, that came from experience, that came from being first, from being attacked by fire for first time, from learning that fire was now weapon, that burning was now tactic, that modern warfare had turned into fire, the aftermath, the response, the learning at Hooge, after July 30th, after the flames, after the fire, after the threshold was crossed, the aftermath. The flamethrower operators were volunteers. This fact was consistent, was universal. No conscription for flamethrower units, no assignment against will, only volunteers. The reason was simple. The weapon was too dangerous, the risk was too high, the mortality was too great. Only men who chose could be asked to carry fire, to use the weapon, to accept the risk. The volunteers who stepped forward, who raised hands, who accepted the role, were unique, were special, were necessary, were condemned mostly. The volunteers who knew, who understood, who accepted anyway. The operators who carried fire. The selection process was thorough. Not all volunteers were accepted. The physical requirements were substantial. Had to be strong enough to carry 70 pounds. Had to be fit enough to move with the weight. Had to have endurance to function under burden. The physical standards eliminated some. The psychological evaluation eliminated others. Had to demonstrate stability. Had to show courage. Had to prove capability for role. The weak were rejected. The unstable were rejected. The unsuitable were rejected. Those accepted were capable, were fit, were mentally prepared, were as ready as possible. For role that would likely kill them. For weapon that was suicide often. For mission that was death sentence frequently. The selection that chose the best. The process that identified the capable. The evaluation that determined the operators. Who would carry fire. Who would use the weapon. Who would likely die. The selected operators. The volunteers. The condemned. The training was extensive. Lasted weeks. Covered every aspect. How to wear the apparatus. How to move with it. How to operate it. How to aim. How to control the stream. How to ignite. How to maintain, how to repair, how to troubleshoot. The training was thorough, was detailed, was necessary. The weapon was complex, required skill, required knowledge, required practice. The operators trained repeatedly, practiced until proficient, until capable, until ready. The training also covered tactics, how to approach targets, how to coordinate with infantry, how to withdraw after firing, how to survive, if survival was possible. The training that prepared, that taught, that made operators capable, that made them effective, that made them ready. for mission, for combat, for death likely. The training that was thorough, that was necessary, that produced operators who were skilled, who were capable, who were ready to carry fire, to unleash flames, to cross threshold, to introduce fire to modern warfare. The apparatus they carried was burden, was 70 pounds worn on back, was fuel tank, was pressure cylinder, was hose, was nozzle, was ignition system, was everything. The weight was distributed but substantial, was exhausting to carry, was limiting to movement. The operators learned to move with the burden, learned to function despite weight, learned to fight despite limitation. The burden that was physical, that was also psychological. The operators knew what they carried, knew the tank on their back was target, was vulnerability, was death waiting to happen. The tank that if hit would ignite, would explode, would immolate the operator, would kill him in fire he carried. The psychological burden of carrying own death, of wearing vulnerability, of being marked target, of being obvious, of being priority kill for enemy. The burden that was weight, that was fear, that was knowledge, that was acceptance. The operators who carried, who bore the burden, who functioned despite it, who fought despite it, who died because of it often. The burden of carrying fire. The risk they faced was extreme, was greatest of any combat role perhaps. The flamethrower operator was identified instantly. The apparatus was visible, was distinctive, was obvious. The enemy who saw flamethrower operator knew immediately, knew what the threat was, knew what was coming, knew to shoot the operator, to kill him before he fired, to eliminate the threat. The operators who advanced were shot at immediately, were targeted by everyone, by rifles, by machine guns, by anyone who could shoot. The operators who were hit often died spectacularly. The fuel tank punctured. The fuel under pressure escaped, ignited, created fireball, immolated the operator instantly, killed him in instant inferno. The death that was visible, that was dramatic, that was horrible, that was watched by other operators, by other soldiers, by everyone. The death that was demonstration, that was warning, that was fate of flamethrower operators. That was what happened, that was what they faced. The risk that was extreme, that was deadly, that was accepted. The operators who knew, who understood, who advanced anyway, who used weapon anyway, who died anyway often. The risk, the death, the fireball, the immolation, the fate of operators. The courage required was extraordinary. To volunteer knowing the risk, to train knowing the fate, to advance knowing the probability, to operate knowing death was likely. The courage that was different from normal combat courage was accepting specific death, was accepting horrible death, was accepting visible death, was accepting that you would burn, would immolate, would die in fire you carried. The courage to accept this, to volunteer for this, to do this anyway, was profound, was remarkable, was necessary. The operators who had this courage, who demonstrated this willingness, who accepted this fate, were extraordinary, were necessary, were the ones who made fire weapon possible, who made flamethrower work, who made terror real, who crossed threshold, who unleashed fire. The courage of operators, the willingness, the acceptance, the sacrifice. The operators who carried fire knowing they would likely die in fire, who accepted this, who did it anyway. The extraordinary courage, the profound acceptance, the necessary sacrifice. The mortality rate was high. The statistics varied. The documentation is incomplete, but the pattern was clear. Flamethrower operators died at higher rate than other infantry, died at much higher rate. The service in flamethrower units was brief often, measured in weeks, in months, not years. The operators who survived multiple missions were exceptions, were lucky, were skillful, were blessed. Most didn't survive long. Most died quickly. Most became casualties within short time. The turnover was constant, was rapid, was continuous. The units that required constant replacements, constant new operators, constant training of new volunteers, the mortality that was accepted. That was expected. That was price of using weapon. That was cost of fire. The high mortality, the brief service, the constant death, the operators who died, who were replaced, who died again, the cycle that continued, the mortality that was unsustainable individually. That was sustained collectively. The force that continued despite deaths, despite casualties, despite loss, because volunteers continued coming, because new operators trained, because weapon was effective, because fire worked, because terror succeeded. The mortality that was high. That was continuous. That was price. That was paid. By operators, by volunteers, by those who carried fire, who died in fire often, who are remembered, who should be remembered, who carried fire, who crossed threshold, who introduced fire to modern warfare, who paid price, who died. The operators who carried fire. The success at Hooge had immediate consequences. The German command was impressed, was convinced, was eager to exploit. The weapon that had proven effective would be used again, would be deployed more widely, would become standard. The orders went out. Produce more flamethrowers. Train more operators. Deploy to more units. Use in more sectors. The expansion was immediate. Was deliberate. Was systematic. The weapon that was experimental became operational. The innovation that was tested became standard. The flamethrower that was used at Hooge became weapon that was used everywhere. The proliferation began immediately. Began with German forces. Began with decision to expand, to deploy, to make fire weapon standard part of German arsenal. The threshold opened at Hooge. The expansion began from there. The fire that was unleashed spread, not just physically, organizationally, tactically, strategically. The fire that became weapon, the weapon that became standard, the threshold that opened, that couldn't be closed. That changed warfare. The German deployment expanded through August and September. The flamethrower units were increased, were sent to other sectors, to other fronts. The weapon was used against French forces. The French experienced same terror, same panic, same defeat. The attacks succeeded. The positions were captured. The casualties were light. The effectiveness was proven repeatedly. The weapon that worked at Hooge worked elsewhere, worked against everyone, worked whenever used. The German confidence grew. The deployment accelerated. More units, more operators, more attacks. The fire that spread across the Western Front, that appeared in sector after sector, that defeated position after position, that crossed threshold after threshold. The expansion that was rapid, that was successful, that changed German tactics, that made flamethrower standard weapon, standard method, standard approach for certain operations. The proliferation within German forces, the spread of fire weapon, the expansion from Hooge to everywhere, the threshold that opened, that couldn't be closed. The Allied response was inevitable, was necessary, was driven by need to counter, to match, to possess same capability. The British began development immediately. The reports from Hooge prompted action, prompted urgency, prompted development program. The British engineers studied captured German equipment, studied reports from front, studied what was known, developed British version. The development was rapid, was given priority, was pushed through quickly. By 1916, the British had flamethrowers, had trained operators, had deployed units. The British flamethrower was similar to German, was based on same principles, used same methods, created same effects. The British who had been attacked by fire now attacked with fire. The British who had fled from flames now used flames. The cycle of proliferation, the spread of weapon, the crossing of threshold by everyone. The British development that was response. That was necessary. That was adoption of enemy innovation. That was acceptance that fire was now weapon, that burning was now tactic, that terror was now method. The French developed flamethrowers simultaneously. The French experience with German fire attacks prompted development. The French engineers created French version. The French flamethrower was different in details, was similar in concept, used fire, projected flames, created terror, achieved same effects. The French deployed flamethrowers by 1916, used them in French sectors, against German positions, the fire that Germans introduced, the fire that Allies adopted, the weapon that spread to all armies. That was used by everyone, against everyone, the proliferation that was complete. That was universal. That was inevitable. The fire weapon that appeared at Hooge, that spread to German army, that spread to British army, that spread to French army, that spread everywhere. The threshold that was crossed by everyone, the innovation that was adopted universally, the fire that became part of warfare for everyone, for all sides, for all armies. The proliferation that was rapid, that was complete. That changed warfare fundamentally. The Americans would develop flamethrowers later. When Americans entered war in 1917, when American forces deployed to France, the Americans studied Allied weapons, studied tactics, studied methods, developed American versions. The American flamethrower was improved version, was more reliable, was more effective, but was same weapon, was same concept, was same fire. The Americans used flamethrowers in 1918. In final offensives, in attacks on German positions, the Americans who came late to war, who adopted fire weapon quickly, who used it effectively, who contributed to proliferation, who added to universality, who confirmed that fire was standard, was accepted, was normal. The Americans who used fire as everyone used fire, as standard weapon, as normal tactic, as accepted method. The proliferation that included everyone, that left no one out, that made fire universal weapon. The threshold that was crossed by all, that became threshold that defined modern warfare, that showed what was accepted, what was normal, what was how war was fought. The tactical use evolved. The surprise at Hooge couldn't be repeated. The shock value diminished. The defenders learned about flamethrowers, were warned, were trained, were taught to shoot operators, to target fuel tanks, to avoid panic. The training helped. The preparation reduced effectiveness. The attacks became less successful. The panic became less total. The defense became possible. The flamethrower attack still worked, still created terror, still achieved objectives sometimes, but not always. Not as easily, not as completely. The weapon that was devastating through surprise became less devastating when expected, became one tool among many, became specialized weapon used for specific situations, for specific targets, for bunkers, for fortifications, for strong points, for positions that couldn't be taken otherwise. The tactical evolution from shock weapon to specialized tool, from innovation to standard, from devastating to useful. The evolution that occurred over months, over years, over repeated use. The weapon that changed as defenders adapted, as tactics evolved, as warfare continued. The evolution from Hooge to later use, from first time to 100th time, from surprise to expected, from devastating to incorporated. The tactical evolution of fire weapon. The countermeasures developed. The defenders learned to identify operators, to target them specifically, to shoot fuel tanks. The operators who were targeted died. The tanks that were hit exploded. The fire that was turned against carriers. The flamethrower that became liability as much as asset. The operators who died at increasing rate, who faced increasing danger, who suffered increasing casualties. The weapon that became more dangerous to use. That required more courage. That produced higher mortality. The countermeasures that made flamethrower riskier. That made operators more vulnerable. That made weapon less effective. That reduced but didn't eliminate. That limited but didn't stop. The countermeasures that were adaptation. That were response. That were learning. The defenders who learned to fight fire, to target fire, to kill fire before fire killed them. The evolution of defense. The adaptation to innovation. The response to fire weapon. The countermeasures that developed, that spread, that became standard, that were taught, that were practiced, that reduced effectiveness, that saved lives, that made fire weapon less dominant, less decisive, less devastating, but still dangerous, still deadly, still used. The countermeasures that balanced, that limited, that adapted. The evolution of warfare, the response to innovation, the development of counter, the cycle that continued. The psychological impact remained, even when effectiveness decreased tactically, even when countermeasures helped. The fear of fire remained. The terror remained. The primal response remained. The fire that appeared still created fear, still caused panic sometimes, still was more frightening than other weapons. The psychological weapon remained psychological weapon, remained terror weapon, remained exploitation of primal fear, the fear that couldn't be trained away completely, that couldn't be eliminated through preparation, that remained despite knowledge, despite experience, despite adaptation, the fire that still terrified, that still caused reactions other weapons didn't, that still affected morale, that still impacted psychological state, that still mattered psychologically even when tactical impact decreased. The psychological weapon that remained psychological weapon, that continued affecting soldiers, that continued creating fear, that continued being terror. The psychological impact that was lasting, that was permanent, that was part of what fire weapon meant, part of why it was used, part of why it mattered. The fear that remained, the terror that continued, the psychological impact that lasted. That defined fire weapon, that made it significant, that made it remembered. The psychological impact of fire, of flames, of burning, that began at Hooge, that spread from there, that continued through war, that lasted beyond war, that remained still. The fear of fire, the terror of flames, the horror of burning. That fire weapon exploited, that flamethrower used, that became part of warfare, that crossed threshold, that opened at Hooge, that couldn't be closed, that changed warfare, that added fire, that made burning tactic, that made terror method, that made fire weapon. The threshold that opened, that spread, that was crossed by everyone, that became permanent, that defined modern warfare, that showed what was possible, what was acceptable, what was done. The threshold at Hooge's, July 30th, 1915. That opened, that couldn't be closed, that changed everything. The threshold, the opening, the crossing, the permanence, the fire that was unleashed, that couldn't be contained, that spread everywhere, that became standard, that became normal, that became warfare. The threshold that opened, that never closed. The crater at Hooge is quiet now. The battlefield is farmland. The trenches are gone. The fortifications are erased. The evidence is minimal. The tourists who visit are few. The memory is fading. The story is being forgotten. But the fire continues. Not at Hooge, not in Belgium, but as capability, as option, as weapon, as legacy. The fire that was unleashed on July 30th, 1915, that appeared at 3:15 a.m., that fell into British trenches, that created terror, that caused panic, that defeated defense, that proved fire was weapon, that crossed threshold, that opened door, that couldn't be closed, that changed warfare, that added fire to methods, that made burning tactic, that made terror technique, that made horror standard. The fire continues. The threshold that was crossed at Hooge remains crossed. The weapon that was introduced remains introduced. The horror that was unleashed remains unleashed. The fire that became weapon remains weapon. The burning that became tactic remains tactic. The terror that became method remains method. The threshold can't be uncrossed. The weapon can't be uninvented. The knowledge can't be unknown. The capability can't be eliminated. What was done can't be undone. What was crossed can't be uncrossed. What was opened can't be closed. The threshold at Hooge. The moment at 3:15 a.m. The flames that appeared, the fire that fell, the panic that spread. The threshold that opened remains open, remains crossed, remains changed forever. The men who burned are forgotten. The operators who carried fire are forgotten. The defenders who fled are forgotten. The battle is forgotten. The date is forgotten. The moment is forgotten. But the fire continues. The legacy persists. The threshold remains. The consequence endures. The fire that was introduced at Hooge, that spread from there, that evolved from there, that continued from there, that reaches to present, that exists now, that is with us still. The fire that was unleashed, that couldn't be contained, that spread everywhere, that became standard, that became normal, that became accepted, that became part of warfare, that is part of warfare still. The fire, the legacy, the threshold, the consequence, that began at Hooge, that continues now, that will continue. The fire that was unleashed, that burns still, in memory, in capability, in legacy, in history, the fire. Rest now, the story is told, the fire is explained, the threshold is understood, the legacy is revealed. The first flamethrower attack at Hooge Crater, July 30th, 1915. 3:15 a.m., when flames appeared, when fire became weapon, when threshold was crossed, when terror was unleashed, when modern warfare first turned into fire. The story is complete, the history is told, the memory is honored, the forgotten is remembered. Rest now. The fire burns in memory, the threshold remains crossed, the legacy continues, but the story is told. The understanding is complete. The knowledge is shared. Rest now. At Hooge, where fire was unleashed, where threshold was crossed, where modern warfare turned into fire. Rest now.